A couple of years ago, my family had the opportunity to travel to Zion National Park. And as we've come to appreciate, we like going on a rigorous hike when we have the chance to visit one of our nation's national parks. And well, the hike that we were planning on goes up to a destination called Scout Lookout. And it starts, though, on the valley floor of this canyon, of Zion's Canyon, there along the Virgin River. And it starts out easy enough, a nice meandering pathway along the river, but quickly you start moving upwards to climb the 1,100 feet of elevation till you're just about to the rim of the canyon. And on this hike, we had the chance to go in March, and the weather thought would be rather reliable. Right? Spring break, it should be pretty decent, but not so at Zion. Right? The weather can be uncertain, and so as we make our way up, we start encountering some snow, both there already on the path and falling on us. The path there's like no one there at the park, so we start getting a little bit concerned. Right? If we were to slip, get injured, something were to happen, there's not anybody else around that could come to our aid. And as we hike up the switchbacks known as Walter's Wiggles, we finally arrive there at the top, just up this little spur trail above Scout Lookout. So there we are at our destination point, 1,100 feet from where we started below at the valley floor, and there are no guardrails. There's not even really any path. There's slick footing as just half-inch of snow or so has accumulated. And we've got 4 weary children, 10 and under. Now you can imagine what one dad said. Trying to keep this crew all around. Let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Right? That was the exhortation. If you think you stand, take heed, watch out, pay attention so that you don't fall. And we quickly got off of that point and made our way back down to the nice wide pathway to descend back into the valley floor. But that's the message that Paul is conveying in our passage as he continues in this focus from chapters 8 through 10 here. So he gives focus to this warning about the very real threat of idolatry. He's continuing in this same line of reasoning to impress upon the Corinthians the dangers that they are embarking in as they're trying to figure out how they navigate engaging with contemporary culture and all of the idolatry that was going hand in hand with it. So as we look here at this chapter, at this passage, these 13 verses, there's a lot of really interesting things here that we could ask and spend a lot of time pressing in on. What is Paul saying? What all is he trying to elucidate from what he writes to the Corinthians? There's a lot that you can chase down, but church, I want you to not lose sight of the thing that Paul is driving at, right? The main impetus behind what he's writing. He wants the Corinthians, he wants you and me to be controlled by a supreme love for God and an overflowing love for one another. That's how he started this section back in chapter 8, by focusing on that. He wants our love for God to be supreme, and he wants our love for one another to be overflowing, so that we would engage with one another in the right worship of God as God would have us. He wants us not to be governed instead by all the allurements of our rights and our freedoms and the ensuing idolatry those very things could lead to. No, be controlled by a love for God and one another. So as we look here at Paul's reasoning and what he's trying to convey, to articulate that message, that warning that we would take heed if we think that we stand lest we fall, that main point that he drives at in verse 12 will serve as our outline here. So as you see in verses 1 through 5, he draws attention to the nation of Israel who was thinking that they had a standing. They thought they had good footing. But then we see in verses 6 through 11 their fateful falling. And finally, we'll come to Paul's direct exhortation in verses 12 through 13 to take heed. Just a little bit more here on this context, just to fold this in, because I think it's necessary for us to have to situate this in what Paul is saying, so that we don't just come to chapter 10 and think that he's turned the page and he's just moving in a brand new direction. So recall that as Paul has been addressing the Corinthians in trying to grapple with how they ought to engage with contemporary culture, that he exhorted them to, in love for one another, forgo their right that would be theirs, the knowledge that they do truly have, that meat is just meat, that they could eat meat that has been associated with idolatry. But his exhortation has been, forgo it for love of your brother, that you would not sin against Christ by engaging in such things. And he went on to demonstrate how he himself has been very willing to forgo his apostolic rights in pursuit of the reward of partnering in the gospel, that is the driving force of his life, that he finds his reward to be the very act of partnering in the gospel, of making it known to all who would hear him. And that aspiration, it comes with it of this warning of being disqualified. And this is what we looked at last week at the end of chapter 9 with Pastor Zach leading us there. That there is this very real danger of being disqualified for not subduing your body in self-control. That's not just a hypothetical that he's talking about, but there is a very real danger to our souls that we could be led astray, such that we forsake Christ, demonstrating that we never actually knew him. We know that it is a very real danger because of where Paul goes to next. Verses 1 through 5. We have here before us Exhibit A. There is a danger of being disqualified because we can read of the history of Israel. We can go back to Exodus and Numbers and see that this people who had a standing because of God's mercy and grace, they were disqualified from receiving the inheritance that was promised to them. And this is what Paul jumps into. Consider the grace that was theirs and how Paul articulates this, that he's couching Israel's experience in Christian themes. Did you pick up on this? Here in verses 1 through 5, as he emphasizes that all Israel partook in these things, that they all were under the cloud. Remember the cloud that accompanied them in the Exodus as they departed from Egypt, that guarded them from the heat of the day and was a pillar of fire at night? This cloud was there. They beheld it. All passed through the sea. They walked on dry ground. All were baptized into Moses. They all ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink. Paul's drawing on those Christian ordinances that we partake of and enjoy to make the connection for us of Israel's experience and our experience. That we look and behold all of the manifest grace that was bestowed upon the nation of Israel, the standing that they had, so that we can see, we too, the church, we've received grace like that. We have a standing before the Lord like Israel had a standing before the Lord. And he goes so far as to read the Bible fully in a Christ-oriented way that we see in verse 4, that he identifies this spiritual drink that all Israel was able to participate in was in fact Christ. Christ was the rock that followed them in the wilderness. Christ is the rock who is the source of this water. So you'll remember back in the accounting of the Exodus and the wilderness generation that there was, in fact, a rock, two rocks. In Exodus 17 and Numbers 20, through which God provides water for the nation of Israel. They're out there in the wilderness thinking that they're going to perish because they have no water. And God says, well, here is water that will miraculously come from a rock. Now, when Paul is identifying that Christ is that rock, he's not making the point that Christ incarnated as a rock, right? He's not saying that the rock was physically, like that was Jesus. Right? I don't think that's what he's after here. He's saying that the rock was a type, right? It anticipated Christ who would come later. But not only that, as he describes the rock that was following them, there is this Jewish interpretation from the Exodus account there in the wilderness that developed, that some scholars think that Paul is drawing on here, that understood that there was an actual rock that followed Israel in the wilderness to provide water for them. I don't think that that's necessary for us in understanding what Paul is saying here. We don't see that evidently in the account that we have recorded in Exodus and Numbers. I think Paul's point, rather, is that the rock was the means of God's steady provision for the nation of Israel when they could look nowhere else, when they had to look to the Lord for provision. God was there as a sure and steadfast presence. He was like a rock to them, and that Christ was that rock. I think that's what Paul is driving at here. Because of all of this grace to the nation, Israel thought that they stood. They thought that they were good. They thought that here they were, God's elect people. But did they stand on the rock? Look at verse 5. Paul's commentary. Given all of this grace given to the nation of Israel, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. If you know the story, you know what a profound understatement that is. God was not pleased with most of them. All of them, but two. Joshua and Caleb are the only two of the Exodus generation that made their way through the wilderness and into the land of promise. Only two made it in because of God's displeasure with this people who thought that they had a standing, thought that they had a special place that they might presume upon the Lord. And it was made plain that God was not pleased with them, because they were overthrown in the wilderness. The word that Paul uses here for overthrown, it means scattered. They were killed. And as you read the accounting of Numbers, you see that that is very much the case. That bodies are strewn in the wilderness because of their faithlessness, because of their presumption upon the Lord, because they thought they had a standing, having been delivered out of slavery in Egypt and now being God's chosen people, a nation for his own possession. And yet they did not have that standing coupled with faith and were displeasing before the Lord. We have to see what Paul is doing here. He's not bringing these things up merely to throw stones at the nation of Israel, but he's leading us to look at our own selves. And he gets there when we get to verse 6, referencing how these things were written as examples for us. They're for us to take heed, to pay attention to what's going on here with Israel. If Israel could be so lulled into thinking that they stood firmly, are you really any different? If Israel could be disqualified This people who had these promises and the covenants, if this people could be disqualified, not subduing their bodies in self-control, how about you? The danger is real. The threat is present. Church, you can be part of a great revival. You can be part of a wonderful movement of God. You can drink from the spiritual rock of Christ. You can help plant churches. You can send missionaries to the nations. You can do many wonderful things that would give evidence that you have a standing before the Lord, and God is not pleased with you. That's what Paul is driving at here, that we would have eyes to see and take heed and watch our own selves, not look down our noses at Israel and be like, oh, how could you? How could you respond in that kind of a way? How could you act like that? How could you persist in your idolatry and unbelief that way? No, Paul's point is saying you and I are really fundamentally no different than Israel. We too can succumb to our sin. And so we need to pay attention to the example of Israel. We need to open our Bibles and read Exodus and Numbers and see, okay, Lord, there's people that have come before me that have endeavored to walk faithfully in covenant relationship with you. I'm not the first one. And you've given me a gift here in your Holy Scripture. So let me be instructed and trained by this. Israel did serve as an example for us. And we see that what that example led to in the wilderness. Israel manifestly experienced a fateful falling due to their association chiefly with idolatry. That was the most besetting sin that afflicted the nation of Israel. And as Paul continues to give examples of God's displeasure towards them, the scattering of this people that serves as an example for us, he draws on examples of idolatry, yes, but of these instances where Israel sinned against the Lord, especially with food. And so Paul is drawing on these examples to make the connection to the very point that he's driving at with the Corinthians. That started back in chapter 8, this issue with food. So he's pulling these things together that we would be chastened by God's word. Right? And as he continues on here to provide 4 examples, he leans heavily on the accounting of the nation of Israel in the book of Numbers. And that very fact that he does that without further explanation, he doesn't do a deep dive into each of these stories, but assumes that the Corinthians know what he's talking about. He assumes that these Gentiles have an awareness and a familiarity with the book of Numbers such that Paul can make quick reference to it and know that it will serve the purpose of exhorting this people. Do you have such a familiarity with the book of Numbers? Can you read that book and receive God's intention for you by it, that you would see the example that Israel is and that you be confronted by your own sin, that you be cut to the quick by Israel's example on display there in that book that we can so quickly gloss over? It's a challenging thing that is just assumed by the apostle here. We see that the problem that Israel chiefly had was a problem of desire. And so we see in verse 6 that these things took place, the grace that was given to them, yes, but also the examples that follow in verses 7 through verse 11. These things did take place as examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. That's the fundamental problem there with Israel and the fundamental problem with you and me. A desire for evil, or another translation would be a craving, which I think gets a little bit more at it, a little bit more of a carnal expression there, a craving for evil. Do you have a spiritual sensitivity to perceive that still at work in you? That there is residing in you still yet this morning a craving for evil? It was there with Israel, and we need to learn from what came about as they gave themselves to that craving. And so Paul lays out 4 examples of craving evil from Exodus and Numbers. Why? Because of verse 11. So there's some bookends here in verse 6 and verse 11 to make plain what Paul is driving at for us, that these things, these stories, as it were, not just make-believe stories, this actually happened. They were written down, verse 11, for our instruction. The word also could be rendered our admonition. Paul's not after just merely information here. He's saying Exodus and Numbers doesn't exist just merely so that we know this accounting of how it was that Israel came about from leaving Egypt and coming into the Promised Land. But these things were recorded for our admonition, that we would learn, yes, but be corrected as well. And why have these things been written down? For whose benefit? Was it for the benefit of Israel? No, Paul says it is written for us, on whom the end of the ages has come. This is a tremendous statement, that the church is the end goal of redemptive history. That what God has inspired through his word there in the Old Testament was written for us, that we would benefit from it, that we would be admonished by it, because we are part of that people that is the telos, the end goal, the driving purpose and result of redemptive history. That we are part of this new age now that Christ has come and has redeemed for himself a new people, providing for us through a new Exodus. So all of history is rushing forward to come to the fulfillment that is Christ's bride, the church. That's us. So the weight of history is pushing behind us. And Paul, he makes a similar subtle point back in verse 1 that I skipped over, that he identifies the nation of Israel as our fathers. This is our heritage. Those who have no claim to being a part of ethnic Israel, Gentiles though we may be, these are our people. This is our lineage. It is the goal of history that has rushed upon us who have been baptized not into Moses, but into Christ. So all of redemptive history is functioning to serve our holiness and our perseverance in the faith. So we see these admonishing examples, 4 of them in particular. Let's look at them. He first makes mention of the idolatry that is recorded in Exodus 32. This is the instance, as he mentions this in verse 7, that some of them were idolaters, and delivers the imperative that we must not be like that. We must not be idolaters as they were. You see in verse 7 the quotation here of sitting down to eat and drink and rising up to play. It's an interesting thing that Paul draws on that rather than a section of the accounting of the golden calf incident that is more explicitly related to idolatry. But we see what he's after here, that their eating and drinking is part of the problem, that there was revelry in the presence of idolatry, just like what the Corinthians are devoting themselves to. See, the people of Israel, they walked on dry ground through that sea. They beheld the mountain with the cloud and the thunder and the lightning. And while Moses was away, there in the presence of the Lord, receiving that divine revelation, that they were impatient and wanted a God like the nations. They wanted a God that they could see and touch and behold. And so they compelled Aaron to form that golden calf, and he made that fateful declaration, Israel, behold your gods who delivered you out of Egypt. And while we may not be as prone to such explicit idolatry like that. I think it unlikely that any of us have a golden figurine of some kind that we would bow down before and say, "Behold, this is my Lord Jesus." Our idolatry probably doesn't look like that, but it probably looks a little bit more fundamentally like what Israel was doing, of having a God so that they might be like the nations. Worldliness very well may be the expression of idolatry that we are more prone to. I want to be Christian, but maybe not like one of those weird Christians. I want to be faithful, but I don't want to be uncomfortable. I want all of the pleasures and ease and the things that everybody around me likes. I want to be respectable to my neighbors. I want to be thought well of by my colleagues. And so I'm going to watch the same shows and movies that they're going to watch so that I can interact and engage with them. I'm going to do the same kinds of things so that I just kind of fit in better, and we can cover that with a veneer of evangelism. Oh, I'm just doing this so that I can connect with them. But friends, the great danger of worldliness is the great danger of idolatry, that it leads you away little by little from the right worship of the one true God. So we need to heed Paul's admonition here. Do not be idolaters as some of them were. Do not look to the approval of others such that it would have a shaping influence on the conduct of your life. The second exhortation, to not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did. Paul, he's referencing the intermarriage that Israel gave themselves to with the people of Moab, the daughters of Moab, recorded in Numbers 25. The story culminates in the high-handed variety of sexual immorality that flaunted this immorality, that flaunted this intermarrying, that led to the display of Phinehas's zeal, driving a spear through two adulterers. But the more run-of-the-mill kind that people of Israel broadly gave themselves to, that they pursued, started with sacrifices and eating in worship of these gods, the gods of the people of Moab. And so they were succumbed to worship Baal. The problem with the sexual immorality present there in Numbers 25, it's not that they were marrying people of a different nation, different ethnicity. That's not the problem. It was that they're marrying people who would lead them to worship another god. The fundamental thing is idolatry, is false worship. So as you date and consider marriage, young people especially, give thought. Will this individual help me to worship God rightly? Yes, what you do with your body matters, but far more important is how those acts will lead you to worship other gods. And this is what our culture is very evidently driving towards. The intentional efforts of the sexual revolution to undermine anything that God would say is good and true and beautiful, and destroy it so that you can find your identity in who you think you are on the inside. As you look to satisfy these drives that are affirmed day in and day out, be watchful. It will lead you to forsake worshiping Christ and Him alone. Third test, one of these additionally remarkable statements that the apostle makes in verse 9. It says, we must not put Christ to the test as some of them did. Remarkable statement that Israel put Christ to the test. He's referencing The situation in Numbers 21 where the people of Israel are complaining and asking of Moses, did you bring us out here in the wilderness to die? I think this testing that is going on, it's not a test like kids are like, maybe you've got planned coming up this week. Maybe you've got some quizzes or tests at school. It's not a test like that to see, did you pass the test or not? Did you know the material or not? It's not that kind of a test. Rather, it's a test of character. Are you actually who you say you are? It's that kind of test that they put ultimately to Christ. It's a test of asking, is he faithful? Is God faithful? He delivered us out of Egypt and brought us out here into the wilderness. Is he faithful to do what he promised, to bring us actually there into the promised land? Is God faithful or not? And it was given expression through this grumbling, through this attributing of ill motive to God's purpose. Because their question, it was not a question in earnest. They had already come to a conclusion about their test. They're saying, no, God, you are not faithful. You are not good. You are not going to do what you said you were going to do. You're not a faithful God. You failed the test. And that was a grievous source of displeasure from the Lord towards them. Do you put Christ to the test? Do the questions bounce around in your head of, God, why did you let me marry this person? God, why did you give me these children? God, why did you give me this job? God, why did you put me in this family? Friend, watch out. Take heed. Such testing of the Lord, it is faithless. It is putting yourself in that position of authority over the Lord that you would know what is best, what is right, what is good. Humble yourself. Put your hand over your mouth and confess your faithlessness to the Lord. He is faithful. This testing, it goes hand in hand with the grumbling. The final example of how Israel was scattered, overthrown in the wilderness. Paul's referencing, I think most likely, Numbers 16, in a situation that arose after Korah's rebellion, and God issued judgment on Korah and his compatriots in their rebellion against Moses and the God-given authority that Moses had. And the people of Israel, seeing the judgment brought upon those rebels, they grumbled before the Lord. And this is perhaps one of the most significant dangers for us, because grumbling is such a respectable sin. It's a little bit colder today. We'll grumble and murmur about that. Eventually it's going to snow. We'll grumble and murmur about that. Summer comes and it's 100 degrees and we'll grumble and murmur about that. It is so commonplace in our context, obviously not unique, that humanity has grumbled for all of human history, that we just grumble and murmur. We just complain and bemoan our situation, and yet it is so commonplace that we just tolerate it among one another. And it's understandable to a certain degree that our emotional reaction to life's hardships, there's a sense in which that is good and is going to happen when it is steered by faith. There's a sharp distinction between lament and grumbling. We can lament before the Lord when life is hard, and that is good because it is steered, directed, governed by faith. It's, Lord, when are you going to come and show yourself true and faithful? When are you going to come and deliver me out of my affliction? Do you see me, Lord? I'm turning to you. Grumbling is just complaining, wailing on your beds instead of crying out to God. Sarah Critch, she had made a comment this week that helps us make the connection between that emotional response, that grumbling, and idolatry. She commented how you can't change your emotions until you change what you worship. You can't change your emotions until you change what you worship. That grumbling, that emotional response to life's hardships, they're revealing something. They're revealing what it is that you actually are worshiping, what you are esteeming and valuing. And that heart change isn't going to come about until your worship changes, until you cease and turn from worshiping that idol, that idolatrous thing, and worship the one true God. This is what the apostle is driving us at, that we would be on guard against all the forms of idolatry and the expression that it finds. And so, church, we need to receive the admonition of Israel's example. Israel, who thought they stood but fell. This is the very thing that Paul is driving at for us. So we see verse 12. Take heed. Look out. Don't be lulled into thinking that you know what you can handle, what your freedom would permit you to engage in. No, be vigilant. Be ever watchful. Don't ever presume upon the Lord's kindness and grace to you. That is why we need to give thought to what Paul will go on to say in 1 Corinthians 15 that we read earlier. This good news that Paul preached, that we received, in which we stand and by which we are being saved. The ongoing need, the ongoing reality for us to lay hold of the truths of the gospel and apply that to all of life is the very means by which we take heed, that we guard ourselves from thinking that we stand, presuming upon our standing, that we would actually stand, that we would reorient on the gospel day by day. And that is, in fact, what I think Paul is driving to here in verses 12 and 13. How do we do this? How do we be vigilant and take heed and look? Two things we don't do and one that we do. So we take heed by not exaggerating your plight. This is, I think, what he's after in verse 13. He says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. There's no temptation that has caught you that is not typical among humanity. So don't over-exaggerate your plight. You have not suffered or been tempted the most of all of humanity. Don't play the martyr card. The temptation that has caught you, it's normal. Second thing, don't look within. Don't exaggerate and don't look within. We see this as well in verse 13. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. That has been taken and twisted in the common phrase that God will only give you what you can handle. And that sounds good because it's a half-truth posing as a whole truth. That's not true, though. It's not that God will give you only what you can handle. Paul's point here in verse 13 is not that you would look to yourself and the resources found within you to endure in faithfulness, to take heed, to watch out. That's not what he is after at all, but that is what that assertion leads us to. It's like, oh, God's only given me what I can handle. He knows what I am competent for, what I'm capable of. That's not what the gospel says. It's not about your ability at all, but about what God sovereignly permits. Right? It is what he has allowed for you to experience. The temptation that he has permitted to come your way. And so what is our right response? By reorienting on the faithfulness of God, who permits temptation and provides a way of escape. God is faithful. That is what you need to know, and you need to work into your soul. God is faithful. The temptation that he has ordained in your life, he has only permitted it insofar as it serves his sovereign purposes. And he's not only permitted that, but he has provided a way for you. He provides the way of escape The end of 13, that you may be able to endure it. This doesn't mean that there's an escape hatch for you to pull the lever and all of a sudden you're scot-free from that temptation. It surely does not give you license to continue to pursue your sin, presuming upon the Lord's grace that, I know that God is going to give me a way of escape, so I'm just going to keep looking at this thing, keep talking in this way, keep pursuing this idolatry, and I'll just pull the escape hatch one day, and man, I'll be scot-free, good to go. Don't presume upon the Lord's grace like that. That is thinking you stand, just like what Israel did, and they fell. And it will too lead to your falling. That's not what Paul means when he speaks of this way of escape. It's not an escape hatch. It's a finish line. So consider this illustration. Last weekend, had the opportunity to do this long trail race. And the last 2 miles was on this sandy trail. Have you run in sand before? Not like the nice packed sand right there, like where the waves crash down, but sand that has been trampled over and kids have played in it and it's all loose, right? It's impossible to run in. You feel like you're not going anywhere and your legs are just dead. Right? And so as you're running along on this sand, you got 2 miles to go, and where's the finish line? And then it comes about finally with just about 400 meters to go. You can see that the trail goes on for miles more of this deadly sand that's just going to kill you. But there's a turnoff, and that's where the finish line is. You can see the turn. It is the way of escape. All you have to do is endure to that point and take the turn, and there's the finish line, and you've made it. And seeing that finish line, seeing that turn, how it promotes endurance. So, I'm almost there. That's what the apostle has in mind. That God provides the way. He provides the finish line. He's saying, friend, brother, sister, look, there's the finish line. Keep going. Right? The escape hatch doesn't promote endurance at all. Keep going. Press on. God is faithful. He will see you through. That's where we turn to, that we would faithfully take heed. On that hike up to Scout Lookout in Zion, there was a section where typically you're going along the face of the canyon wall, but there's a section where you have to leave the face of the canyon wall and you turn back into the canyon. Cliffs on either side. And as the trail cuts back, the wind is funneled through there with such tremendous force. And so here I am with my family, and we're tired and weary, but we've got a destination in sight. We want to arrive there. And as we cut back into the canyon and the wind is rushing past us, I notice a little outcropping of rock. So we take the opportunity to tuck ourselves out of the wind and back into the rock, that we might have a respite. And friends, that is what the Christian life is like. It is a grueling hike, but Christ is a refuge to us. He is a refuge. So don't look within for the resources to be strong. Don't play the martyr. The Christian life is hard, and there are dangers that abound, not least of which is your own self. So take heed lest you fall, and cast yourself on the God who is faithful.